Welcome to Women Speak, our video series here at Wolf, where we talk to interesting women who are speaking out on important issues today that impact the lives and rights of women across the world. I am here today with Rachel Damiano and Katie Medart, who are two women who were fired for using their free speech to talk about issues that relate to gender identity. They are two educators in Grants Pass, Oregon. Katie was a 7th grade science teacher, and Rachel was the North Middle School assistant principal. And so today we're going to talk about what happened with their case, why they were fired, and what they have going on next, and how you can support them. So thank you so much, both of you, for joining us.
Thanks for
having us. Thank you for having us.
Rachel, why don't you start by just giving our viewers a quick summary about who you are, what happened to you, for anyone who may not be familiar with your case.
Yeah, so the quickest summary is we were placed on leave after we expressed some opinions about gender identity education policy in a video that we were promoting a grassroots organization that we called I Resolve. And then the school district caved after a small number of very loud voices. We started crying out and not liking what we were saying. And so they placed us both on leave, and they launched an investigation against us, first from the district and then from a third-party administrator, or a third party. The school district has changed its policies throughout us being on leave, and which forces teachers to put a disclaimer on anything they say that they deem controversial. And it's even in a simple conversation that you have privately at home. And we feel that violates the First Amendment. And then recently, last Thursday, there was a hearing in front of the board of directors where the board voted and approved both Katie and my the recommendation from the superintendent to fire us both. So we are both terminated.
Yeah, that hearing was crazy. And we're definitely going to talk about what happened there. So Katie, why don't we start by first, you tell us a little bit more about I Resolve. What is this movement? What are people resolving to? What are you proposing?
Okay, so we are a grassroots movement, and we have basically 4 main points to it. One is that we want to relabel bathrooms based off of anatomy, since bathrooms are, most infrastructures currently are based off of form and function, so based off of the anatomy that individuals have. And so we would like to relabel bathrooms as anatomical male, anatomical female, and even though we do support, when funding is available, gender neutral bathrooms, and then have those bathrooms and locker rooms actually used based off of anatomy. Another point that we have, our policy idea that we're suggesting, is that parents, we want to require that they're involved for a student to be able to change their name. So if they want to change their name, so say you're questioning your gender identity, that it requires parent permission, both for pronouns changes and for legal name changes. So not any preferred name changes. So we require parents to have to be involved. And, but finally, that we protect our First Amendment right for all individuals, and that you can't mandate that. So every individual would still reserve the right to be able to decide if they want to be able to honor the preferred name change or the pronoun change that's being requested.
Yeah, I mean, those sound like perfectly sensible proposals to me that protect the rights of people on all sides, no matter how you want to refer to someone, what your belief is on those issues. And the bathroom policies seem to make perfect sense to, take the idea of identity out of it and focus on the thing that really matters in that specific context, which is the anatomy. And so I think that's perfectly reasonable. But then you guys put a video out about this, didn't you? How did that go?
Yeah, we created a video during spring break, totally off our school time and not even using school resources. And we created a video that basically we wanted to inform the community of state and federal legislation that is potentially coming down, and if passed, would no longer give people freedom of speech, would restrict that. And so we wanted to propose different ideas and say, hey, legislators, hey, community, here's a different idea. You don't have to use it, but here's a conversation starter as something that's reasonable and tolerant. In the middle of the road, we put that video out in the middle of spring break, and it was out for about a week before, I know we'll roll into this too a little bit later, but before there were concerns about it. So it's on our YouTube website. iresolvemovement.com. If you wanted to check it out, it's on there. But it just describes a Senate bill coming down from Oregon, and then it talks about the Equality Act and just the concerns we have as educators and how that affects youth organizations.
And so how did this backlash start against the video? And were you guys expecting this backlash? What were you hearing from the leaders at your school or in your district before all the backlash started? And then how did that tune change?
So we believe in being transparent, right? The goal was to, how do we take this shared public space with a wide variety of different opinions and viewpoints on how do you handle gender identity issues when they arise. And so we put it out there. We brought our ideas, we shared them with our leadership. So our school principal, with the human resources director, and with our superintendent. And so they were in support. I heard things such as, I'm going to get out of the way. I've tried for my principal and let you and Rachel do your thing. and so we also heard that Rachel can speak to this, as she directly heard from our superintendent. So I'll let her give a quote from him as to how she heard directly his support for us.
Yeah, so when I talked to the HR director and then talked to the superintendent, the HR director had talked about how they were creative solutions and they were something that they hadn't thought about as being as verbiage, right? And then when I talked to the superintendent, he said a similar thing. These are creative solutions. They are, they involve all students. And so our superintendent had said he was going to bring it to the legal team, make sure we're not violating any Oregon revised statutes, which we weren't, and that's been proven multiple times, and that he could bring it to the board of directors.
So these people were supportive of you up front, saying that they thought your solutions were creative and that they were even going to bring it to the very same board that then only a couple or maybe a couple months later at this point decided to terminate you for doing this. So how did you get from your principal and superintendent supporting you to suddenly that very man sitting across from you in this board hearing arguing for your termination?
So it was about a week after we posted our video, some staff members identified us, because in our video, we didn't even give our last name. And we were speaking to multiple districts, 2 states, 2 federal bodies, with the goal of it being that we could have hopefully a national impact, not just local community impact. And so realizing that this is genuinely a matter of public concern across the nation, dealing with gender identity. And so, but after about a week, some staff identified us and then were offended. And so they wrote in complaints as 5 individuals. And then we were immediately placed on leave. We actually were, before placed on leave, called in with our superintendent actually and said that he just wanted to meet to share some concerns, but did not believe it would lead to any discipline. And then shortly after that, that was on a Wednesday, I think, and then maybe, and then that following Monday was when we were put on leave. So it went from sharing concerns, don't think you'll have any discipline, to now you're on leave.
Yep, and those formal complaints officially came in the 2-3 days after that initial conversation. And when we say a few, we mean 5. It was 5 complaints that got us put on leave and ultimately led to our termination.
I mean, that you hear a lot of stories, and as some of our viewers may know, I've been through a similar thing myself, but the fact that it takes only a tiny minority of very extreme voices on this issue. And Wolf has polling out there that shows that the majority of Americans agree with what you two put out in your resolutions, essentially, that we want parents to be involved in decision-making that affects their children, especially when it comes to health stuff around gender identity. We want bathrooms and single-sex spaces to be based on anatomy and your biological sex. Like, this is what the majority of Americans want. And so your belief that you're putting forward is not a fringe or extreme one. It's actually the most common belief among American voters, and yet a tiny minority of people in your district were able to have such an outsized impact to enforce their belief system, essentially, by getting rid of you. I'm really curious, what did you ultimately think of the reasons that the school board used to justify terminating you? Because there was a lot of talk in this hearing of the different policies that you guys violated, the use of the school materials, to receive an email from someone else.
Yeah.
I mean, just really what seemed, I mean, I know it's not an actual courtroom, but it's hard to not think of the term kangaroo court when I saw how this hearing went. I watched the whole 4 hours of both of you, and it was really grueling to watch, but also very inspiring how you two kept your cool the whole time. And really, honestly, I think put them in their place a lot of times. And we saw some of the board members reacting positively to your arguments, but at the end of the day, there were board members who were saying that they were voting to terminate you. And some of the reasons they gave didn't seem consistent with the arguments that the administration actually put forward. So what do you make of that? How did that play out?
Yeah, I can speak to my hearing because that happened right before Katie's, and then Katie can speak to hers. We almost, when we had talked at one point, thought, Katie, if they terminated me, could just come up and say, well, you already terminated Rachel, so go ahead and terminate me too, because we know what you're going to vote. But in essence, what the lawyer tried to claim, and I don't think you heard the same thing from the board members, she tried to claim that we had used district resources and time for a political campaign. And I think we proved over and over throughout the hearing, Katie's hearing, my hearing, that it was not a political campaign according to our Oregon revised statute, the actual definition of the term. Now, do we all agree that this has been a politicized issue and that it's a matter of public concern? Yes, but that's not the same as a legal definition for a political campaign. And that legal definition is what the board policy that they say that we allegedly violated is in contradiction to. So they said that we were political campaigning, which again, not legally accurate. And then they said that we used district time and resources for political campaigning. And I think that was left out of the hearing a lot. It was specifically for political campaigning. That's what the board policy says. It doesn't say use of district time and resources, period. It says for political campaigning. And we proved it wasn't political campaigning. And then, of course, the comment that I think demonstrated the feeling of the entire room was when one of our board members made a comment about not feeling like he could support an administrator going back into the schools where students might feel unsafe, whether that's real or that is their feeling. And to me, that's giving a lot of power to a perception of a small group of individuals. And so I think that when that board member said that, it was, there it is. That's why you actually want to terminate us. It's not because of alleged policy violations. It's because you don't like what we said and you have a perception of what we said, and therefore you're going to fire us. And then we rolled into Katie's.
And, before Katie, we hear about yours, let me actually just read the quote from this board member, because I think you're right that it really does paint the picture here. He said, and keep in mind, by the way, this was a 4-3 vote. So one person's vote made all the difference for both of you. And he said, it's hard for me to see how allowing this administrator to say will not make some group of our students feel less safe in our schools, whether that is real or their feeling. And that right there, he goes on to say, our top priority is to make sure all students are as safe as possible. And so that is why I am accepting the superintendent's recommendation to terminate. And he says it right there, that's why.
Absolutely. And to me, and I know that this isn't an argument against what he said, and that's not really the point of discussing why they terminated us, but I look at that and I say, you say small, and then you say all. So who do you actually mean? Because all means all. How are we protecting all students? How are we making all students feel safe? And not just about our policies, but if you take someone who, Katie and I both have stellar employment records, we both are excellent employees, and I know that sounds really big-headed, but that we are. I mean, and I can attest to that in watching Katie, so I can just speak to Katie, then I don't sound prideful. But Katie is an amazing teacher, and the way she holds herself, and I think she's demonstrated that through all public appearances. She's the same way in private. And so in looking at that and then saying, taking these two excellent employees and saying, if a student feels unsafe, therefore these excellent employees should be terminated, That is not keeping all students safe, because that's taking two excellent employees out of the school system and who are there to protect all students. And now you're opening up a gap for all students to not be protected, and therefore making it an unsafe or a less safe environment overall.
Absolutely. It's so disingenuous. I think that it really shows this false dichotomy and this prioritization of what is honestly not even true. That is so common in this debate, the idea that these students would be unsafe with teachers who disagree with something their parents think politically. It's absolutely nuts. And never mind the students who may actually feel more unsafe now that you're gone. What about all of them? And maybe, Katie, this is a good time for you to jump in about your hearing, because during your hearing, and I'm so glad that you didn't just roll over and say, well, you already terminated Rachel, so I guess I'll just go then. Because you, I think, brought some, I know you guys were time limited, and so you brought some really strong arguments that I think Rachel didn't have time to address during hers, and including referencing some students who really resonated with what you guys were advocating for. So, Katie, what did you think about how your hearing went?
I will say I felt like the mindset was already determined beforehand, having watching Rachel's and then seeing what the outcome ended up being. But it was, like you said, we decided that having that opportunity to address and bring out the voice of other students that I had heard from, because the report used against us by the third-party investigator, it was, in my opinion, very biased, but I think not just my opinion. It's now open for the public to review. And I think as individuals, if they take the time to go through that and not just read the summary of findings and look at the actual evidence, they will see that for themselves, just as board member Gary Richardson pointed out to all the public that was listening and there to view our hearing. So I'm grateful for the opportunity that I did have to be able to point out just that, no, there's a lot of students that are thankful that we have taken a stand and had courage.
Yeah, absolutely. And, some of the other reasons that these board members gave for terminating you were, I want to say appalling, but, I wasn't at the end of the day shocked, because I think you're right that going into it, we could tell that people had pretty much made up their minds. The board chair seemed like he was trying to not be biased or act biased while being very clearly biased. And it seemed like the other board members had really gone in with their mind made up in various ways, except for one board member who just seemed a little confused. And on such a tight vote, where it was at the time when he was voting, it was 3-3, and there's an older gentleman who couldn't hear any of the proceedings. And first, Rachel, during your hearing, he said that he couldn't hear, and then someone had to explain to him how to vote, and then he voted to terminate you. And then Katie, during yours, he actually tried to abstain, admitting that he didn't understand what was going on, and was told he couldn't abstain. It was crazy. I mean, your fates are in the hands of someone who does not understand the proceedings in front of him.
Yes. And that was extremely disheartening. And I will say back, just to even clarify, that I think is more disturbing, is the person who pulled him to privately explain during Rachel's hearing was a district attorney. And then he came back and voted the way that the district attorney wanted. And so I think that can't be an oversight, or at least should be heavily considered as far as the person who was single-handedly advising him when he made it clear that he didn't understand what was going on.
And when you talk about drama, right, sometimes Katie and I feel like our lives are movie drama, and we're like, you can't make this stuff up, right? We are in the hearing, and this board member who has been on the board since 1986, he has done a huge service to the city of Grants Pass by serving and volunteering for this long, because our board members don't get paid, right? And so he's done this really long service, and he couldn't hear. And if you were in the proceedings, you would know it was really hard to hear. And so knowing that, he couldn't hear what was going on. And ironically enough, that board member, Mary Kate, that you quoted earlier and saying it's about feeling, got up to go and help him. And the entire community behind us said, no, not him. No, he can't be the one that helps. And you could see he kind of smirked and then went and sat down, and that's who wanted to go and help him explain. And then, yeah, the attorney for the district came, picked him up. And not only did he have a conversation, they walked back behind the library bookshelves where no one could see them, had a conversation, and he came back and said, oh, I vote yes. And that's what terminated me. And then with, in Katie's, it was interesting because the same thing was going to happen. And then Katie's lawyer said, I object. This is not how this conversation can go. And then all of the lawyers went over, had a conversation, and came back. And then it was re-explained to him, and he voted. He again tried to abstain. But again, you can't make this drama up. But at the same time, it was really hard for us to watch that happen because he couldn't hear what was going on. And he said it over and over again. I could not hear. Please explain this to me. What are you saying? I couldn't hear that. And the sound was really difficult to hear. And interesting enough, we had asked that it had been moved to a different location before, knowing that there was a different location that would have been much better and would have allowed everyone to come in and see it for themselves. And we were told no, and they wouldn't move it.
I mean, you're right. It absolutely was like watching a courtroom drama. I mean, I was fully prepared when I had your guys' hearing on to be multitasking and like get some work done while I'm watching. And I was just captivated by this. I mean, by your speeches, by hearing the arguments on either side. It really was. And then Cliff getting up and trying to abstain and going and being pulled off by the lawyers. It really was very dramatic. And I'm in a group chat with some other radical feminists, and we were all like just live commenting on what was happening. And Katie, during yours, when it seemed like Cliff was going to abstain, there was this moment, and I'm curious if you two felt it too, where we felt, whoa, maybe things are actually going to go different for Katie. This might actually turn around. She might pull through this one. And what would that mean for Rachel then and for your lawsuit and everything? Like, did you have that moment where your hopes got up for a second?
Yeah, I did, especially because mine started with an affirmative action to keep me. So the initial first round of voting was to be able to keep me. And so I was like, wow. And after Rachel and I talked about it, she's like, I actually got nervous sitting there thinking, well, how is this going to go? And not that she hoped that I would be terminated, but that those same questions that you brought up of just, what could this really be? This might turn out differently. So I definitely felt that. Rachel, you definitely felt that as well.
Yeah, I reached over at one point and grabbed her hand and was like, oh, you could stay. And then mine started reeling like, oh, okay, yes, this would be good. She needs to stay. She needs to be in the classroom. She's an amazing educator. This is great. Wait, and they're firing me. Okay, right. We will come to grips with this. And then it went the other way, and it was just this like, oh, we had it. We had that hope for a moment, the way that it should have gone ultimately.
Yeah.
Yeah. It really did. It felt so close for a second there. And you're right with I had forgotten about the affirmative vote at first, and then they had to do the other vote then to terminate. And, I was thinking at that moment, maybe Cliff is just going to vote no on anything because he doesn't understand what's happening. And so then I thought, well, maybe Cliff will vote no on this one too. And it, obviously didn't go down that way, but there was that moment then. And so now that you have been through all of this, and although actually, Katie, I had one other question that I wanted to ask for you specifically. That this was a little unclear to those of us watching, and I know the sound was really bad in there. It was pretty bad out here too. I had to turn up my computer to like 200% to hear a word of it. But they were mentioning something about your union in the beginning, and I was wondering, and I think a lot of other people are curious, where are the teachers' unions on this? Why didn't they defend you?
So I believe, and that this is just my speculation and my opinion, being a teacher at the union, the one way that I've had support is I have an OEA attorney. That's who was there to represent me. So my union.
And what is OEA for people who might not know?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's Oregon Education Association. So that's our Oregon teachers union. And so I had my OEA attorney there to speak on my behalf. But as far as I think, a lot of people think of the union as when they have an issue, we rise together as a group of educators and make a very powerful position. And so I believe there's a chance that I'm on the wrong side of what their agenda is on this. And that's why we haven't seen that public appearance. Again, that's just my opinion. So,
yeah.
But
Well,
looking
that's
at
good to
what's
know.
coming down in the school and what's in there. Because I also know that there's a lot of educators who have said that they support us. Thank you for being martyrs. We stand silently behind you. And it's because they're terrified of the same retaliation should they speak up and say that, yes, we stand and give their opinions as far as that they agree with iResolve and our policy educations that we have shared.
Yeah, and that retaliation is obviously very real, and it's something that a growing number of women in this country have faced, myself included. I was fired in 2019 for very similar sorts of reasons. I spoke out about this issue, and then they found some policy excuse that was bullshit, and managed to find some sort of way to claim that I had violated a policy. And yet here we are, all speaking up on this louder than ever. But there's loss that comes with that. And I know that you all have faced personal loss, professional loss, and you've also faced a lot of threats and harassment because of everything that you've been put through in the public. So I'm curious if each of you can share a little bit about how it really has impacted you.
So this occurred not right away. It actually happened after the superintendent sent out an email to the staff and to the community and called us out and said, this movement that's going around is anti-trans. We were called anti-trans, and then, but he said it was in direct contradiction to the values of the Grants Pass School District. And then suddenly, our social media blew up, our emails blew up with these harassment, threats, bullying, intimidation. That weekend, so that happened, and then that weekend, my dad actually came into town and helped me put in a security system. I changed locks on my doors. I know that Katie started using her security system even more. And there was just this, we haven't been through this before. We need to make sure that we're safe. And then obviously with the impacts with right now, our loss of income, our loss of insurance, even there's a TSPC, which is the Teacher Standards and Practices Commission, and the complaints went up to them as well. And so now there's a potential loss of our licenses if we're found guilty of these allegations that they've sent up there as well. And if that happens, we can't work not just in the public sector or in the public schools, but it also in accredited private schools. If you have to have a license for an accredited private school, it removes you from that too. So that's why I think I've been saying I don't know for the last week 10 bazillion times, because when people say, are you applying for another job? I don't know yet, because if I work even at a private school and I'm at a private school and they pull my license in the middle of the year for these allegations that are false and I lose my license, well, then I get fired again because I don't have a license. And same thing with Katie. And I think Katie too, in speaking to her family and her beautiful boys that are amazing. And I know that it's had an impact in her family as well, not just in loss of income, but in other ways that Katie can speak to.
Yeah, so definitely the loss of license. For me, I was the primary provider for my family. And so we're fortunate that we have had savings, but I'm angry that I am forced to have to use that right now just to pay our bills every month. And that wasn't my plan for them. But again, I'm grateful that we have made the decisions to have savings. So it's just put a lot of stress. Like immediately I have been researching insurance, and and the minimum side of that for my family of 4, we're looking at is $800, and that's on the low end side of things a month going out. Wow. For not very good coverage. And so, I'm going to have this huge expense going out every month when now we already don't have the means to be able to make our monthly bills. And so it's just a lot of new added stress and pressure figuring out the logistics of that, and very real. I would say also the defamation of character. So I had a lot of people speaking from the district as for my values, meaning they were giving false values of me that were inaccurate, telling my students that I'm anti-trans. And that's just, to me, that is, it hurts more than that. It's just wrong. So, and that's speaking very kindly about it. And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you want to talk about feelings of unsafety and hurt feelings. It's hard to ignore the impact that this has on the real lives of actual women. I mean, I'm really glad that you two mentioned the security system thing. That's actually not something I've heard a lot of women in this space talk about before. I don't think it's something I've talked about either, but that was a serious thing that we did as well, is we installed a security system, and that's an expense. And, and all of these things are expenses, and it adds up. And, we know women in the UK and Canada, a lot of our sisters there are going through the same thing. A lot of them don't necessarily realize that you lose your health insurance too when you get fired here. Yeah. And it's not cheap to pick it back up. And so then you have to actually make a decision sometimes between financial stability and the health of your family. And that is an actual issue of safety for real children, like whose safety and health has now been put at risk because of this. And it's really heartbreaking, but nonetheless, you two are not backing down. You've been as fervent as ever. Your speeches to the council or the board were fiery. And I mean, for me, honestly, they were even vindicating. I didn't have a hearing when I was fired. I didn't pursue a lawsuit. I just felt really like run down at that point in my life. And I didn't have a support system. And it was kind of before this movement had picked up a lot in the public. And so seeing you have a chance to really go out there and defend yourselves in public, and we could hear the crowds cheering for you, and we could hear the boos when someone did something unethical, and we could see the support that you were getting online as well. And I think that was really vindicating for a lot of women who maybe have had something happen quietly and not gotten a public chance to argue in their defense. I know many women also go through this, and then they're pressured into signing NDAs after the fact in order for things. I know a woman who was pressured to sign an NDA so that her health insurance would continue a couple months, so that her family wouldn't lose their health insurance while she looked for another job. And so it's really great to see you two pushing forward in the public. But I wonder, now that you've gone through all of this, I guess number one, did you know what you were signing up for when you made your video in I Resolve? And would you do it again?
Yes. I mean, yes, because I would do it again. And to speak to Mary Kate, what you were talking about, even with the public and the hearing and the ability to speak, and how that can be hidden from people too, that they have that right. So we weren't even aware, but we were recently made aware that we get a post-termination hearing. So that was a pre-termination hearing. We were never told that we had a right to a post-termination hearing until we're a small town. And so rumors get around. So if someone, whispers it somewhere, you'll hear it. And we heard it whispered, and we reached out and said, hey, is this a thing? Do we get this? And they said, oh yeah, you get a post-termination hearing. So we'll get a post-termination hearing at one point.
Oh, they thought they were rid of you.
Yeah, no, they are not. And so with that, what our understanding of that is that basically now it's the board. Now it's not them saying we accept the recommendation. Now it's like, okay, board, what do you decide? Where are you standing? Not just, yeah, we're accepting this recommendation. Yeah, we're just accepting the report. What do you actually believe? And so we are looking forward to that. But do we think that, or for me, did I think that we would have as much negative outcry for the false perception that we're anti-trans or pedophiles or all the other different names we've been called? No. When we were creating these, we truly in our core believe that they are reasonable, they are tolerant, they are middle of the road, they are nothing outlandish, they're not far right, they're not far left, they are very middle of the road policies and very tolerant in the true sense of tolerance, not in what tolerance has been co-opted to be. I think people have stolen that word to claim something different. Like basically, if you don't believe me and you don't, I can't coerce you to my side, I'm going to say that you're not tolerant and you're a bigot, and that's not accurate. So I don't think we saw that explosion of hate. I think we thought it would be big in terms of getting people up and saying, hey, we got to come up with some solutions for this. And would I do it again? Absolutely.
And I agree with Rachel. I would do it again as well. I think that I expected, I'm realistic in that even when we sent out our draft to get opinions before we launched our final product, we had people who shared feedback with us to be able to say, hey, no, what about this? What about that? As a way to be able to make it so that it truly was the heart to bring all different groups of people together. And so knowing that, I would say yes, that we thought that realistically, like she said, it would go big because we genuinely believe in our heart that it's at least a great starting point for policymakers to use to solve a very challenging issue right now that is impacting all students, all minors. And so in some way or form, and so knowing that, we thought that there was good odds that it would blow up. But as far as like the false narrative about us and losing our jobs and being canceled, no, I did not personally see that coming. Nor did I see my administrators thinking that these people who I trusted and were transparent with, did I believe that they would do a 180 and totally change course. So that I did not see that coming. And that has been hard to process and hard to accept.
And I think especially because when we talk about not expecting the hate, especially from the LGBTQ community or from allies that perceive us one way and then are defending whether the LGBTQ community believes that or not, or parts of the LGBTQ community. And one of the reasons why we didn't expect it as much is we reached out to members of the LGBTQ community, and not just members of the LGBTQ community, but to people who think very differently than us, right? And we reached out and said, hey, if you read this, what would you think? What would you change? What would bring you to the table to at least start the discussion? And so it's not like we went into an echo chamber and yelled and said hello and only got hello back, right? We went out and said, hey, people, come to the table, have this conversation with us. How do we start this and have it in, again, a tolerable or a tolerant way? Because ultimately, and I'm going to get on my soapbox for a minute, ultimately in education, that's our job. Our job in education is to teach our youth and demonstrate to our community, this is how the United States does freedom. This is how we have conversation. This is how we do it lovingly. This is how we do it in a way that we're going to walk away and say, okay, we disagree, but I don't hate them. I'm going to respect them for having strong beliefs, whether I agree with them or not. We're not saying everyone has to agree. We're not saying that everyone has to walk away and go, oh yeah, nope, I believe you now. But the point is that we in society have lost the ability to have conversation in a respectful manner, that we say, I might disagree with you, Mary Kate, on some issues, but we're going to walk away and I'm going to respect you as a fellow human and a fellow woman that says, you know, we don't have to agree on everything to be kind to one another, to be tolerant of one another, and to function in society and move our society forward instead of polarizing our society to where we are now.
Yeah,
I can get off my soapbox now.
That's awesome. It's a great soapbox. You can live there for all I care. I mean, I completely agree with what you said. And I think that during your hearing, there was a moment that made it clear that this isn't about an actual concern for safety or something. It's about fear over what ideas people could have in their heads if we dare let you two speak. And that was when one of the board members said, I don't think there should be a debate. And that was very blatant and it was super to the point. It's something we hear a lot online in this discussion from one side saying that there's no debate here. We can't have a debate. when in everything else in society, like you said, this is how democracy functions, is we have questions about things, we talk about them, and then we try to get to something that works for the most people. And that's just not what we're being allowed to do here. And instead we have a minority of the LGBTQ whatever community, when we know that there are members of the LGBT community who very much disagree with this, myself included, who would not want these people speaking on our behalf and saying that, you know, this is what we want as a community. And instead they're silencing the debate. And you're right, this debate matters so much. And I'm curious what, especially as educators, now I know, Katie, you're a science teacher, which, by the way, I also wanted to point out that a lot of this debate tends to center around biology and sex and reproduction and whether that's real or not. And you're literally a science teacher, so I think you know what you're talking about there. But as educators, I'm curious where you think this puts us as a country as far as where we stand with free speech. Does free speech even exist in the United States anymore? Do you have hope that your rights will be upheld in the long run? What does it mean when it's, you know, in your case, you're public employees, but for a lot of people, we're not public employees, we're employees of private institutions that don't have First Amendment obligations. And so what does that mean for the rest of us? I'm curious what your take is on that.
So I think that the comment from the district lawyer was really telling in terms of what at least the district that we formerly worked for thinks about an educator's right to freedom of speech. And her comment was, teachers do not have freedom of speech in the classroom. And to me, that's really concerning, because there is a board policy that actually says that they do have freedom of speech in the classroom. And it's restricted in some ways, but not completely gone. And so to make that comment that educators have no freedom of speech, they do not have freedom of speech in the classroom, is concerning. And so, but I also think that the once we get to the Supreme Court level, when you look at cases that are there right now, I think that the Supreme Court has been upholding, absolutely, you have freedom of speech. You have freedom of speech to, in terms of actual transgender policies or gender identity policies, you do have freedom of speech whether to use or not use pronouns. And again, I think that what tends to happen when we have this conversation is that people start to push together, okay, they're not going to use their pronouns and therefore they're going to be disrespectful. That's not it at all. Saying that I or someone, right, doesn't have, it violates their conscience to use a pronoun, to use an opposite pronoun for someone, doesn't mean that that means they're going to throw and spew hate at them. And to throw and spew hate at someone for assuming that is just as bad as if they were to spew hate. So I think that we live in the United States where we have a democracy, we have freedoms, and I think that is going to be withheld once it gets out of this bubble of loud voices. So I think the bubble of loud voices needs to be pushed aside by the louder conversation that says, no, people have free speech and we're going to do it in a way that's tolerant and loving and reasonable. So I think that it will be shown overall. We live in a interestingly liberal state, I'll put it that way. And it's just pockets of Oregon, not all of Oregon, but pockets of Oregon that have loud voices. And so I think being realistic with our case, right, we don't know what it's going to look like at the lowest level and then even at the appeal level, but we do believe that justice will be served and that our freedom of speech will be upheld eventually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm very glad to hear that. And I agree also. We have seen even in some similar-ish cases at the circuit level where a professor's freedom of speech was upheld and not using preferred pronouns, aka wrong sex pronouns in the classroom. And so we were very glad to see that. But of course, it was not in your district. And it's also interesting because they're not saying that you were fired for your free speech. They're saying you were fired for these policy violations. And this is so common where they find another, like a way to try to make it an issue about something else so that they don't have to address your free speech. When at the end of the day, we know, and Katie, you pointed this out during your hearing very well, I thought, that people do the things that you guys might do, talk in the hallway with your coworkers or receive a personal email at your work computer. on other issues all the time, including things as trivial as a basketball pool, or things as serious and certainly political as the 2020 election. And they do these things, and they're not being fired for policy violations. It was obviously the content of what you guys were doing, not a political campaign, but the actual policies that you were advocating for that were so offensive to some people, despite being what the majority of people believe. That is what forced them to get into this debate, and which ultimately resulted in the retaliation. And I do wonder, though, sometimes, do you think that, and I know I just mentioned another case where it was a man, so maybe that's a counterpoint to this, but I'm curious if you think that would two male teachers have been treated the same way as you?
Thinking back on earlier, we actually have a classic example that's in our lawsuit related to Black Lives Matters. And I'm not here to say if it was a man or a woman, but it was all involving men. And to date, I don't think any of them have received consequences. Well, we have our superintendent who's a male. We had two different staff members who were both men, one expressing support for Black Lives Matters, the other one expressing opposition. But to date, I have not heard of any disciplinary action that any of them received.
Yeah. And, it struck me during your hearing that, I don't definitely not trying to throw him under the bus because I think he was great. But what Gary was saying was really similar to a lot of the things that you guys had said. And it seemed like it was hitting differently, at least to some degree with some people. And I think that, Katie, your background and expertise in biology was really left out of this conversation a lot. I did not see that mentioned nearly anywhere except for in that passing bio line that's included in an article. She was a 7th grade science teacher. But, actually digging into your lawsuit, I really saw how extensive your background in biology was. Why don't you go ahead and tell us about your education?
So yeah, I did an honors program, and my degree is in cell molecular biology with a minor in chemistry. And so then I did a master's of arts in teaching, and I've taught a high school science level, and then I taught for 7 full-time years and then a number of part-time years at a local community college. So teaching upper and lower anatomy classes, biology, and then also some chemistry classes as well before coming to the middle school. And so my opinions, my opinions don't just come from science. So they come from science background. They come from looking at the medical field, which usually crosses over, right, with the scientific community. And then also from my own personal faith beliefs that I have. So when I hear lots of arguments of why people disagree with, especially like the bathroom and what we're suggesting, and having the biological male or female using the one that they feel, how they identify, so that based off of gender identity, I think that it's often assumed that it's only religious beliefs, that people don't want them to go into the opposite anatomical bathroom. And so for me, that was very black and white. And I have taken so much backlash for saying, so in essence, it should be used for genitalia. And but for me, that is very, there's not controversy in that.
I know you two have mentioned you've gotten a lot of support behind the scenes. I'm curious what you might say to those who are thinking about speaking out, have seen your case, and maybe that made them more afraid. But what would you say to them about speaking out?
Especially educators, I would ask you, why not? Right? What is the purpose of education? And here I go back on my soapbox again. But right, in democracy, and education is guiding the next pool of leaders. Our next president is in school currently right now, somewhere, whatever that age is, or a future president, and future politicians and future leaders and future, right? These students are becoming the next generation of America. So what are we teaching them? Are we teaching them to be silent? Are we teaching them to back off when something that's not even very radical? Are we telling them back down? and give in to bullies. Back down, and if someone comes up with a fake, false allegation that should stand, no, it shouldn't stand. And that's where the cry should be, even if people don't agree with the resolutions. Even if there are aspects of the resolutions that say, I think it should change to here, and I think I should change to here. Okay, but everyone, and Katie has said this multiple times, everyone can come together on freedom of speech. And everyone can come together and say, every educator has a right to give ideas, especially on their own private time, and not feel like they were going to not get canceled for giving those ideas. And so I would just empower the staff. I would empower our board of directors, local board of directors, or school boards, right? School board of directors to put out statements, not just ours, but other school boards and say, okay, staff, we as a school board are going to protect your freedom of speech. Therefore, we are giving you an avenue to have this discussion, and we will not cancel you for it. And I think that when people start standing up and saying, no, we're going to take back the Constitution, we're going to take back rights, then that's when the shining light of what America is supposed to be shines back through. Because you think about, why did we break away, right? Why did we break away from Britain in the first place? We broke away because of tyranny, and we cannot let tyranny stand. And our Constitution encourages fighting back against tyranny.
Absolutely. It's so well said. And I think it's really important to remember that while freedom of speech has become weirdly politicized, as if it is a right or left issue, and I think right now we tend to associate freedom of speech more with the right. That's really ironic, because it should be the thing, like you said, that can bring everyone together. Because without freedom of speech, all of the progress and change that the left wants is impossible, because freedom of speech is what allows us to change the status quo, whatever that is. And that is something that is necessary for democracy to function, for progressive values, for people to have freedom of religion, to have all of it, to have all of the things that make this a free country. And I hope that people will not just look to protect freedom of speech when it's something that we agree with. And that's when it's easy, right? Like, this is something I agree with, so I want to protect this speech. But when it's something that we do find abhorrent, I think it's really important for us as a movement to recognize is that freedom of speech is, yes, there are times when there are restrictions and limitations placed within reason, but it's not a one-sided thing. And I think that we need to remember that. And I think that people on the other side of this debate need to remember that too. Right now, they might have the power to silence your speech at the district at least. But what happens when they're the speech that's silenced? And if they want to create change in the world, if they want to change the status quo to say, help kids who identify as trans or something, they need free speech to do that. And what if they're not the ones in power anymore? And so this really is not a political or one-sided issue. And that's something I think that we really need to remember. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how your lawsuit might be able to hopefully establish this as a norm a little bit, at least within your district. So why don't you give us the rundown on where your lawsuit stands, what we can look for next in that case, and what we can expect to be hearing out of it?
Yeah, so in terms of the lawsuit, and to emphasize, the lawsuit is about freedom of speech. It's not about what the resolutions actually say. So it's about a revised policy. So the board, again, partway through our being on leave, revised the same policy that they say that we formerly violated. And once it was revised, well, then we would have been in violation, but we weren't in violation ahead of time. And so we stopped all speech because of it. And we stopped our social media. So you'll see a big gap in when our social media happened. And so that's what it's about. So whether you agree with the resolutions or not, again, it's about whether we have a right to speak on our private platforms or not. So our next steps for that is it'll go to a hearing, and that I think it's in October or November. The legal process is a very long process. And so that's coming soon as well. There have been a couple of decisions just on preliminary injunctions that our side wasn't even heard on. And so I think that goes back to eventually, I think we will get the justice that we deserve. So that's where that is. And then again, in terms of the school, we're not done with the school. We have a pre-termination hearing. We don't know when that'll be, but we've asked for it and been told that we will be having those. And so that'll be our chance to ask the board why or what do you decide? Not just agreeing, but what do you actually decide? That'll be really telling. And then also, not in terms of our lawsuit, and we are definitely not leading this charge, but I think that we have seen from what happened in the hearing and what has been the outcome, in a positive way, our community and communities around us have woken up and said, whoa, what is going on around us? We've been asleep. And so the community has woken up, and in our area, at least for our school district, there's some recall efforts happening. We're not leading those, but those are happening. So I think the positive thing out of this has been that people are getting involved in their community, which I think is necessary. And then in terms of when you can hear from us, I mean, you can always follow us on social media at iresolvemovement.com, and then also, or on iresolvemovement.com, and then on Instagram, we're iresolvemovement. But we will definitely keep you guys in the loop as to legally what's happening next.
All right. Well, we definitely will be following your story. I really look forward to hearing what comes out of your case. I know that, a lot of our viewers maybe haven't been through lawsuits themselves, but it is quite an arduous process of a hearing for this and then appealing that hearing and then going and back and forth. So it might be a long time before we do finally get justice for Rachel and Katie, but we're definitely going to be looking forward to that. And I have faith that it will happen. And, even if it doesn't ultimately go your way, I think that you have already been incredibly successful in creating the debate that this issue deserves. And I think that that's really the win here at the end of the day. And so thank you both so much for doing that, for sparking this debate, for creating change in your community in a way that so many people, I think, are scared, and rightfully so, to do. But you stepped up at a time when a lot of people are unwilling to, and there's a lot of people out there right now who are very grateful for that. So thank you from all of us. And thank you for joining me here today to talk about this. It's so great. I mean, we've talked a couple times now. I really enjoy it. You guys are just two really genuine, great women. And I'm really inspired by all of your work. So thank you.
Well, thank you, MK. Yeah, and thanks just to Wolf, because I think you guys you're leading by example as what the power is when a body of us come together to stand with one another to be heard. And so it's really been inspiring for me. And so thank you.
Yeah, this is something we talked about in private, but I really love that we can come together as women on this issue, and that sometimes there are things that we're not going to always agree with everyone on. Maybe we don't see eye to eye on every single issue, but at the end of the day, there are things that unite us together. And I think that it's so powerful. I think that this is one of those issues. I think this is the issue of our time for women of our generation, and of the multiple generations who are in this fight right now together. So it's really been an honor working with you two on this, and we're going to continue to. And there will be links in the description below of where you can find iResolve on their website and on Instagram, where you can sign the resolution if you agree with it. Even if you don't, I encourage you to continue to follow along their story and support their freedom of speech, because at the end of the day, that is ultimately what we're here for and what matters. So thank you both. Again, I will let you go.